Welcome to the Pop Cult Podcast. Here are your hosts, Ariana and Seth.
This is the Pop Cult Podcast. I'm Seth.
I'm Ariana.
And we're reviewing two new releases that came out this year. Later on, we'll be looking at the big A24 potential awards hit of the year, Past Lives. But first, we're going to be looking at the Romanian drama RMN. Matthias returns to his parents' mountain village in Transylvania, longing to see his ex, Celia, again. Arriving on the scene, he notices the unrest caused by Celia offering two foreigners work in her bakery. This is the latest film from Romanian director Cristian Mungiu, who has previously directed the film 4 months, 3 weeks, and 2 days, which is a film about reproductive rights and abortion in Romania that got a lot of acclaim. But that film, I believe, came out over a decade ago. Yeah, 2007. So it's been a while. He's made other movies, but he really hasn't been on a lot of, awards radar, anything like that. So he's kind of gotten lost in the shuffle. What did you think of RMN, Ariana?
I thought it was a very interesting film in where the main protagonist is not someone that we are deeply supposed to relate to.
We're not supposed to like him.
And we're not supposed to like him. And he really doesn't even get a redemption story at the end of the day.
Well, I would even say he doesn't really... He's mean, but he's not a villain, though. He's just an uneducated brute.
Yeah, it's like this quiet intimidation that's always lurking about when you're around him. Like the moment that you think that maybe you got through to him, it turns out he's kind of like, I'm sorry that you feel that way, but what I'm telling you is correct.
And he often acts impulsively in ways that feel like he's trying to assure people that he's a man.
Yeah,
I got that vibe especially when he's interacting with women. It's a very sort of, I will dominate this space and you will do as I say. Mm-hmm. Even if he's been absent from these people's lives for years, He thinks he can just walk back in, and because of his authority as a man, he can just dictate. The title RMN was one that I wasn't really sure about, and I had to look it up afterwards. But it's the Romanian abbreviation for what we would call an MRI. Mm-hmm. And that's essentially what the film operates as. It is not just like an MRI. The MRI doesn't give you the solution of how to solve the problem. It just simply shows you that there's a problem.
Yeah.
And that's what the film is doing. It's never attempting to tell you, and here's how you will solve this. It's just doing a scan of Romania at the present time and showing the audience, here is what we see when we look at this country and the cultural groups and the conflicts. And I don't know how to solve it, but we first have to acknowledge that this is the problem that's going on, kind of a thing.
Yeah.
And so what I thought was really interesting was the complexity of the conflict in this movie. So you have your native Romanian people. You also have the ethnic minority of the Roma, which they refer to as gypsies, a slur. Yeah. Then you have a lot of ethno-Hungarian immigrants that came to Romania for economic reasons over the last decade or more.
Yeah.
And then you have these two, which eventually grows, I think, to 3 Sri Lankans that are brought in by the bakery management to work there. Mm-hmm. And just the way people were at each other's throats was so fascinating to me, because there really wasn't one group that had figured it out. There'd be groups that would chastise others, but then go about doing the same things they were doing, just targeted at a different group. So, for example, the Hungarians are the most vocally opposed to the Sri Lankans, mm-hmm. even though this is not, from an ethnic point of view, their homeland. I assume some of them, the younger ones, were probably born in Romania. So as in terms of citizenship, they're Romanians. They don't want the Sri Lankans there. The Romanians chastise them for being this way.
Yeah, there's some Romanians that chastise them, and then there's others that are happy to go along with them just because their skin matches each other. There's also that conflict of when there's that group setting where everybody's talking about what's going on. Like,
it's a Facebook group they start.
no, I'm talking about when they're going to the community center to talk about what's happening.
Oh, well, I don't want to get into that scene quite yet, because
Yeah.
that scene to me is like the jewel of this movie.
But I want to remark about like the shifting of languages that you wouldn't pick up unless like you've actually watched the film. And like it's also like this complex thing of, because of what's going on, the layers they start.
Well, I was wondering how the Romanians have a strong prejudice against the Roma.
Yes.
And so they see there's a lot of Romanians that see the Hungarians as being simple-minded because they are anti the Sri Lankan. But some of these same Romanian people will make slurs about Roma, calling them gypsies, disparaging them.
It's like it's conflicting because they've accepted the Hungarians as people who live within their community and are part of their community.
Well, some of them have, some of them haven't, because they kind of bring that up in the movie about, you're not even from here. You don't get to say what we do.
However, they have a huge dislike towards the Roma people, and it's that interesting thing that Romania, within the collective mind of Europe, has thought that it's majority like occupied by Roma people, even though it isn't. It's just there's like a confusion of sorts.
Well, I think the film does a really good job of showing us how Eastern Europe has still not been fully integrated into the greater European Union, the sort of body of the continent. That Eastern Europe still feels like the backwaters of Europe. It's very comparable. I kept thinking of like, oh, if you remade this movie in the States, this would be set in like the Appalachians or something.
Yeah, like you would want to do it in a place that's like, I would say go with Missouri, because it's like that Missouri is like that mix between not sure if they're like Southern or like Midwestern.
I was thinking because of the mountains, it made me think of that kind of like the Ozarks, the Appalachians, where you have people with lots of, and you wouldn't necessarily have the Hungarians. If you made in America, they would probably be like Mexican. And so they would have come decades ago to this region for some industry that's based there. And then now you have some third group of immigrants coming in that everybody's getting kind of like tense about.
Yeah.
But what I think is interesting is that Matthias's whole journey kicks off with him not in Romania and not in his hometown. He's in Stuttgart, Germany, working in a factory that butchers sheep.
Yes.
And he is called a lazy gypsy by his supervisor. And Matthias is not Roma, he's Romanian. But because he is called something that he hates himself to a certain degree, he lashes out, severely injures his manager, and then just runs. Mm-hmm. And so when he gets back to his hometown in Transylvania, I think it's interesting that he's the character that we focus on, because if anything, he would relate most to the Sri Lankans out of anyone there. A worker who's outside of their home, who's simply just looking for money to support the people back where they came from.
Not speaking his native tongue, that doesn't understand the language that everyone else is speaking. It's like he does speak German, and then when he gets home, he's upset at the fact that his wife has not been teaching his son German, which is also like very conflicting, because it's sort of like, well, how much German does she know that you expect her to teach him German? And he comes in with so much criticism on how she's raising their son, but
he's absent. He's been absent.
And there's like this feeling like that he doesn't really call them.
Well, he isn't even with her anymore. He's clear, like everybody knows, he is wanting a relationship with Celia, who are they supposed to have been like childhood sweethearts from when they were younger?
I think it was like they were together before he left, and that she was considered part of the Roma people.
Okay. And so that's what kept them from getting together.
And she is far more educated than he is.
Yeah, and that's an interesting conflict in the movie that like creates all sorts of interesting scenes between the two of them. Is she's able to articulate why she's doing something, and she simply isn't going to back down because he puffs out his chest and says, "I am the man, you have to do this." And she kind of like mocks him to his face.
Yeah, and it's also like the fact that she has different interests. She plays instruments, she watches foreign films, she has like, she argues at times with her boss who owns the bakery, because when they're talking about like the lack of workers and how much bread they have to distribute, she's sort of like, we have to raise the money, but and her boss is like, well, we're not part of the European distribution. So once we get that money, we'll be able to do it, but we still need the workers. And there's a conflict of interest between them because it's sort of like she understands that the moment that she gives this work to other people who would come in to live within their community, something bad is going to happen. But her boss is sort of like, whatever, I don't give a shit.
They simply need workers on the line.
Like, we need workers on the line. And there's this constant dialogue within the film on how there are no young people within the working like ages that they're looking for that can take the jobs there, because
like Matthias, they're all moving to Germany,
to get better and other places to get better jobs. However, there's also like these things of it being like, oh, they become part of like the Sri Lankan people become part of the European Union, and then they get like 100 and 500 euros
relocation funds,
like all this stuff. Like they're saying it with envy, but it's also sort of like,
well, and they're not wrong that like if the European Union has this money to give, why aren't you giving it to countries that are within the European Union that need it? But at the same time, they're trying to fill jobs that there's no one there, and they're like needed jobs. I also forgot the Frenchman that lives in Romania, who's part of an NGO, who the Hungarians and the Romanians both see this guy as, they perceive him as looking down on them, thinking he's better than them. And I think he tries not to do that, but inevitably he is, in terms of the film, the representation of Western Europe, intruding into their lives and trying to tell them how to do things better.
Well, yeah, and like he's there to study the bears, and everybody finds it laughable because they're just like, we haven't seen bears in fucking years. Like they care about the bears and wolves now because they're reappearing, which is sort of like this, it is like this mixture of like knowing as much as I know about like the wolf population within Europe that was reintroduced years ago, like to some people is a great thing that this is happening. But to them, they're kind of like, we shot them, we made them go away because we need to protect our farms and our children. And now you're coming here to protect them and not give us any protection.
Well, and then there's an ongoing subplot through the movie of sheep disappearing. And what I think is interesting is that subplot's never resolved in the movie.
No, it isn't.
And then like because the film kicks off with a shot of Matthias's son walking through the woods to school, and it's the camera sort of pointed at the boy, and the boy sees something, but because the camera's focused on the boy, not on what he's seeing, we never know what it is. And later the mother claims that the boy said he saw a man hanging in a tree.
Yeah.
And there's never any follow-up to that. And so it's a movie that has these, it almost feels like hinting at a supernatural,
like he's like the child that has
premonition. Because later we do see someone hanging from a tree. I don't want to say who, because that kind of spoils something about the movie, but it starts to make you think like, oh, the boy is kind of seeing, we could look at it metaphorically, like the boy is envisioning the future of this place.
Yeah,
he's seeing things come to pass, and it terrifies him.
But there's also dialogue that there's like, because his grandfather is filling up his heads with this idea that immigrants are walking around the woods like kidnapping children. Some people think that's the reason why he's seeing things,
and that's kind of what starts to turn more of the people against the Sri Lankans, is this, well, maybe the Sri Lankans are stealing the sheep. Maybe they're causing these problems. But it's like, and it doesn't make any logical sense.
Yeah, it's funny because it's like some of them are like, the disappearance of the sheep was occurring before they come here, and it's not as if we see an abundance of a neighbor saying, "Oh, I got an extra meat going on here." Like there is an implication that Matthias is sort of like, when he goes to see his ex, he's like, "Oh, I have meat, and I was going to bring it to you." And
because he stole it from where he worked, I guess.
Yeah.
And so you'll think like, oh, that's going to make him suspect, because people, where'd he get all this sheep meat from? The sheep are disappearing. Yeah. So once again, that kind of puts him in a place where he could be.
Well, I think it was implication
that he killed a sheep,
like that he stole from his dad, because like
when
he runs away, like he has nothing on him.
That's true.
And it's like this. It's also this coldness that Matthias has when he is running away, like versus stuff that we've seen like in, for example, Joyland, that the main character, you can feel like, oh, they're panicking because they're doing something that they're not supposed to do. Matthias does not show that with
Well, it's just this
like,
sort of keep looking straight ahead, keep moving, don't think about it.
yeah, and there's a coldness about him that kind of expands, and then he gets upset when people don't follow his rules.
Particularly Celia.
Yeah.
When she is housing the Sri Lankans to protect them, and he doesn't like the idea of men being in the house with a woman he claims is his. And I love the way she just kind of like sets him straight about that. Is like, I am not your property. You don't own me.
Yeah.
If I don't want you in my life, you won't be in my life.
Yeah.
You don't get to determine that. But I think the crown jewel of this movie is the town hall scene.
Yeah, it is.
It is visually and thematically incredible. Like, it could be a short film unto itself.
Yeah, because I feel as if in that moment, the lens is no longer as interested in Matthias as it is more in Celia. And
well, I want to describe it to the viewers.
Yeah.
First thing, it reminded me kind of a Roy Anderson shot, like a pigeon sitting on a branch reflecting on his existence, where it's that the camera never moves. The camera is stationary and it's framed kind of at an angle. So it creates a very obvious foreground and a very obvious background. And things are happening in both of them constantly. But the way Celia is positioned is she is in the center of the frame. And there's multiple conflicts happening. There is the conflict between the Hungarians and the Romanians. There's the conflict between the locals and the Sri Lankans. There's the conflict between the workers and the bakery. There's the conflict between Celia and Matthias, who wants to figure out what he is in her life.
Yeah.
So he knows like what he's supposed to do. And she's the only person that crosses over into all these conflicts. And so it's so beautiful that she's in the center of the frame.
Yeah, she's stuck between Matthias, who's like a seat behind her.
Her boss
is
next to her.
Her boss is right beside her.
The people who are on her right.
And what's very interesting is like what's supposed to be like the head, like what's supposed to be the priest and the mayor, they're off screen.
Yeah. Well, so I want to talk about the priest real quick. It is a movie that also shows the ineffectiveness of the church, because the Sri Lankans show up to attend services because they are Catholic, and they're rejected from the church because the congregation doesn't want them there, and the priest just bends to their will. And I think the director is showing that in these conflicts, the church is useless because it will always appeal to whatever keeps the congregation, because the congregation feeds the church money. And it doesn't care about these outsiders because these outsiders are not going to bring the church money. Yeah, and it was
based on a true story that happened in Romania of
towns. It was ethnic Hungarians and Romanians turning against foreign workers at a bakery there. And so it's like you're saying, we don't see the voices of the authority. They're off screen. Because it's the people
of the authority are bending to the will of people without giving them actual like facts.
And so what we see is the mob. We see the mob just riling each other up, getting each other angrier. There's men and women both spouting ignorant things about the Sri Lankans.
Oh yeah, it's like kind of it's not surprising, however, it's horrendous to have to like listen to.
It's scary. It's a scary scene.
Because like it's not as if they're going, they're dark and they're bad. They're going, their immune system is different from ours. And because they're handling our bread, we're going to be taking into viruses that maybe that like we're not immune to.
It's very 21st century misinformation.
So it's never like we should be suspicious of them because they're going to steal. They're just sort of like, they're different. And there's this constant thing of saying we are fine with them as long as they stay in their own countries.
Which is, that very white supremacist mindset of, well, no, we just need white dominated nations because then we'll know that we're safe and strong.
But like the remark that hit the most, which was the one that you were like, oh shit, was when they're just like, well, why can't the other EU countries take them? They're the ones that colonized them, not us.
And I was like, that is actually a really good argument, because Romania did not go around the world colonizing indigenous people. Romania just stayed in Romania. Now, there's issues with the way they have been prejudiced against Roma people, of course, but they are right that these places that have been colonized and as a result have created refugees because they're nations are destabilized is a result of places like France and Germany and the more dominant, wealthy European
Yeah, and
countries.
it's pointed out because the Frenchman speaks, and
Yep.
he's not speaking Romania. He's speaking. I think he started speaking English.
Yeah, that seems
And
to be, and I think that's also a very interesting thing, that the universal language, when you don't know it, the person's native tongue, is English. Yeah.
And that is like, it's something that we've seen personally here
Mhm.
living in the Netherlands. But it's also that interesting moment where the owner of the bakery is speaking one language and they actually like condemn her because they're like, you need to speak Romanian, like what are you doing? And she switches, but you could see like she's bothered by it. And it's also like the declaration from everybody that they have decided that they are no longer going to be partaking in the bread, but it's like, and they're arguing about like the minimum wage.
Well, I think it's the person who brings up the wages is not speaking when the rest of the townspeople are talking shit about the Sri Lankans. He speaks up when the issue points to the bakery and why they need these workers there in the first place.
Yeah.
And so I like that. I got the sense he's maybe like a union leader, was pointing out that he has nothing wrong with the Sri Lankans being there. His argument is, don't tell us we're not willing to work at the bakery until you're honest about why we're not willing to work at the bakery. You do not pay living wages.
Yeah, and it's like they're paying minimum wage. And the funny thing is like nobody applied for these jobs until Siska underneath Celia underneath her boss's like direction says remove the salary, but remark that we pay double if worked overtime. And she does that, and suddenly they have applications from people outside of Romania.
Yeah.
So meaning even if you were outside of Romania, you would consider it like too little to work for.
Yeah.
And
when I think the director does such a great job of laying out these conflicts, humanizing everyone involved.
Yes.
And so you can't really say, well, clearly this person is an idiot and this person is correct. It's a very hard, difficult situation. And it also brings up questions around the ideas of globalization. And is globalization a problem, or is this a problem with societies as they develop? Is it just something all societies go through, the sort of xenophobia and lashing out at outsiders, and eventually they reach an equilibrium? Because at one point, the Hungarians were probably treated similarly to the Sri Lankans, but they've embedded themselves enough that they clearly aren't going anywhere and no one's forcing them out of the village.
Yeah.
They're still not wholly accepted, but the idea would be that at some point you can see that they'll just be kind of homogeneously mixed in with the Romanians and no one will notice.
It's also like that point that when a Hungarian person was speaking about against the Sri Lankan workers, one Romanian person said, well, in my community, we do not reject people. We are welcoming. You are not an actual Romanian if you are going to like be prejudiced towards other people.
But then you point out there are issues with the Roma.
Yeah.
So it's like, well, I don't think that's a blanket statement.
And it's also like there is a remark during the conversation that like, well, over time, if more Sri Lankan people come in, they will embed themselves and it'll be fine. But then someone goes,
they'll change our culture.
They'll change our culture. But then someone says, but we still have the Roma problem. And like they're like remarking on how it is an issue. And like for Celia, that is such a problem because she is identified as Roma. She lives in the woods, and it's like this thing of them being like, well, they go over to the houses in the woods and they take over those houses, and it's just supposed to be like that's where they're most comfortable living.
Yeah.
And she's not harming anybody. She's considered part of the community. She is not used slurred against, but it's because she's educated.
But has she suppressed her Roma culture in order to integrate with a community inside their village?
And we don't really get that much of her because it's sort of like she is living on her own.
There's no family or anything. She's isolated.
She's isolated, and it's such an interesting film when you start viewing it from all these different angles, because even when they decide to go to the community center and talk about it, the Pakistani people are not allowed. The Sri Lankan people are not allowed inside to know what the dialogue is,
and they can't even share their own voice, even though they're the subject being discussed.
Even though they're the subject being discussed, and it will also be like very conflicting to do it because there would need to be a translator there. However, even though the minimum wage is touched, nobody is talking really. They talk about very lightly about the fact that there's no workers around to take these jobs. So they're kind of like, but the jobs that they take over in Germany and other places, that's really hard work.
Yeah, they justify their own migrant workers, but then condemn the migrant workers that come to where they live. It's also
kind of confusing because we see the work that's being done in the bakery. So you're kind of like, why can't Matthias do that then? Or why can't he take over his father's sheep stuff?
Because when he comes back, he never takes up a job or anything. No, he just kind of wanders around.
Because like they offer people to help go take a job at the bakery, and he's like, it's too little money.
And so he sees it as beneath him.
And then like I can understand that to a certain degree. Like you have skills and you know how much it would take to survive.
He was working at a sheep butchery. So it's not like he's a doctor or something. He is a laborer. That's what he does.
It is this thing that within our own communities, we undervalue these things. And then we are appalled when people ask for a certain amount of money because of their labor. And it leads me to believe that over time, if we continue with the globalization, then we have to all agree on a minimum wage, right?
I saw some interesting arguments against this movie. I saw some people who hate it. And they argue that they think that the director is arguing from a neoliberal perspective and that he is looking down on his own native Romania as being ignorant, and that they need to move past their ignorance in order to grow. And so the argument I saw was saying that he's defending this sort of neoliberal globalist capitalist ideology that shuffles workers around based on the needs of industry, not on the needs of the people who live in places. I don't know if I'd be willing to say, like I said, I think the title being their word for MRI, and what an MRI is it's not a diagnosis.
No.
And I argue that I don't think the director is even trying to diagnose the problem. He's simply, or I don't think he's trying to tell you how to solve it. He's giving you just, this is the problem. This is the problem I see, and I'm playing it out in this small space.
Yeah, and I feel like the thing is, like, how do you... And it's hard because it's not within my idea that this movie isn't political. But then why would you want somebody to offer a solution towards something that would be imperfect no matter what without talking about the problem, without showing the issue at hand? Especially when we're talking about the fact that locals, as they're saying, aren't able to take those jobs because the wage is so little.
But then you would have people like Cilia argue that they simply refuse to take the wage because they want something just beyond normal. They want more than you would ever pay someone for this work. But that goes back to, I think, because we have English as the universal language, we have this very globalized capitalist marketplace. These things did not exist in Romania until the fall of communism. And when communism was in these areas, it was not a perfect thing. There were lots of problems. But I think what's happened is one set of problems has been replaced by a different set of problems.
Yeah.
And nothing has actually been solved. And that the director's trying to point to this to go, to him, I think because he's emphasizing the Hungarian and the Romanian aspects of this conflict, we're just repeating the same shit over and over and over. And no one's ever moving forward. We're just getting caught up in collective hatreds of other people.
It becomes a vicious cycle, and it's also like this. I think I have an issue with this idea of just being like, oh, it's a neoliberal thing. It didn't feel that way to me.
I didn't read it as that way either.
But it's also, I would want to know, like, what is that person's perspective? Like, are they from Romania?
And I think they were. And so that's where I'm like, I think they're, of course, with any kind of foreign film, especially the further you get from like the United States and Western Europe, the more foreign a film does become to someone like us, because it's cultures that are increasingly more and more disconnected from the things that we have had normalized for us.
Yeah.
And so, but I think the thing that I liked about the movie was I never felt that it passed judgment on anyone.
No.
I don't want to say the ending of the movie, but there were people I saw who said they thought it was one of the best endings they'd seen in a movie in years. I saw some people saying it was the worst ending they've ever seen in a movie. Where do you fall on that? Because it's a very open for interpretation ending.
I'm like right in the middle. There are times that I really like the idea, and at other times I'm like, that's a little silly.
It is very on the nose, I think.
Yeah.
Because there was something I said to you while we were watching the movie where I said, people keep mentioning this. I keep feeling like that's going to show up. And then at the ending of the movie, that thing that I was mentioning showed up. And I was like, I don't know if I like the fact that I was right and that the movie did what I expected. But I also didn't fully understand what it meant, which did make me like it because it was something I've like ruminated on and thought about, what is that saying? There's also a moment where Celia says to Matthias that she's sorry. And looking at other people's reviews, I was correct in my assumption is that is a vague statement. We don't know what she's sorry for.
Yeah.
I would think maybe it was the way she reamed him out because he shows up at her house with the rifle. And so I'm wondering if from her perspective, she thinks, oh, he's been boiling about the way I spoke to him. And now he's shown up here to like fucking kill me.
Yeah.
So now I'm saying I'm sorry and crying because I don't want him to do that.
Mm-hmm.
But like, I don't know if that, or if there's something else, because there were also hints that he suspected that she had slept with the Frenchman.
Yeah.
Or she had slept with one of the Sri Lankans. And so I wasn't sure if the I'm sorry was her admission that she did one of those things. It just wasn't something that happened, on camera.
Yeah.
But I think that, once again, these are intents of the director. He wants to leave certain things vague for the purpose that they linger with us.
Yeah.
That we think about them and what they could have meant and how they add to the themes of the story. Would you recommend RMN as a movie? I feel like it's more of an advanced course if we were talking about college classes, because it's the first hour is slow and it's just establishing characters and situations. And it's not really until the midpoint of the movie that I feel like that's when all of a sudden I was like, this movie is awesome.
And it's also like one of those films that you have to question yourself. Are you a person that can watch a film, view it in a different lens, despite the fact that the main character that's, guiding you through this is not entirely likable at the end of the day?
Like, he's not reprehensible. He doesn't do unforgivable things. Like we said, he's just a brute. He is an uncaring brute who doesn't seem to understand a lot of the situations that he stepped into.
Yeah.
But yeah, I think it's beautifully shot. It evokes that kind of like damp, cloudy, rainy mountain kind of environment very well. And I think every performance in the movie is just really good. Nora and Hae Sung, two deeply connected childhood friends, are wrenched apart after Nora's family emigrates from South Korea. Decades later, they are reunited for one fateful week as they confront destiny, love, and the choices that make a life. This is the film Past Lives from writer-director Celine Song. Ariana, what did you think of this movie?
I really like this film. It's one of the few films that if we were going to talk about making something simple for an international audience, I would point to this one. The dialogue isn't overly complicated.
Three central characters.
I like the fact that it was kind of like, we are not going to muddle this experience by having the parents wanting a better life for their children. The parents move because they just want to move. They want to do something else.
They're becoming restless with life in South Korea, and they have a new opportunity in Canada.
Yes,
so let's just go.
So they just go. And it's kind of like it's almost as if the writer was like, if you want to see a whole thing about like the struggle of being in America, if you want to see about like the struggle of like leaving your culture, there are other movies for that.
When it's not only that Nora leaves Korea, she then immigrates from Canada to the United States to live in New York. So she's now has two barriers of culture that
Yes.
she's processing.
And it's a touching film that has stuck with me. We saw it yesterday. I want to hear first about your opinion about the film, and then I want to share about my opinion about the film.
I think the film is less about what's directly happening on screen than it is about Nora trying to figure out her identity.
Mm-hmm.
Because when Hae-sung comes to visit in New York, there's comments that she makes that stuck out to me that made me think this was it. She talks about he's so Korean. And she never really unpacks what that statement means. She also says at one point that she feels so not Korean when she's around Hae-sung.
And then also very Korean when
Yeah.
she's around him.
And so it's because she's a writer, by nature, she is introspective. I mean, a good writer has to be introspective. And most writers are very solipsistic. I'll use a fancy word, meaning it's like self-centered.
Yeah.
Because you have to draw from your own experiences to inform your art. So as she's working, and she's a playwright, as she's working out these ideas, part of what she's also trying to figure out is from what perspective do these ideas come from? Do they come from a Korean woman? Do they come from a Canadian woman? Do they come from a woman who's married to an American Jew?
Yeah.
And that's a very complex thread. I think when you look at the story from Hae-sung's perspective, nothing in Korea ever really works out for him. He's just a kind of guy who goes with the flow. There's very little like self there. That's the vibe I got. That so much of him is tied up in he and Nora's like, I don't even know. It's not even really a relationship. It was more of a friendship when they were kids.
Yeah.
Because there was no intimacy beyond like maybe holding hands or anything.
Yeah.
It was just the idea of what his life would have been if she had stayed. But when we look at the way his life is played out, I just got a sense that there wasn't really an ambition. It was more in the way that, she's passionate about her art, her writing. What is Hae-sung passionate about beyond wistfully thinking back to his childhood and the short time he spent with Nora?
Yeah.
But we see him, he gets a girlfriend. We see the brief moment where they meet, and then we jump a few years later and they've broken up. And he has a job, but the job really isn't necessarily what he wants to do. He seems like a very lost person.
Yeah.
And because of that sense of loss, or that sense of being unmoored, of not knowing where to go, he's reverting back to where he thinks things went wrong. But I feel like that's such a folly that so many people do, is they go, if only I could go back and do this, if only I could go back and do that. But then Nora's mother even says, when we lose something, we also gain something.
Yeah.
So the idea that he hasn't internalized that idea, he hasn't realized, well, yeah, Nora left, but he ends up, rekindling his friendship with her over Skype later, which she then recedes from because she sees him as pulling her away from the work that she's there to do. And which in that way, it's sort of, my Korean culture is pulling me away from these ambitions I want that maybe don't gel. I got the sense her parents were not very traditional. No. From the little bit we saw them. And so she's not traditional. And so when she says that when she's around Hae-sung, he seems so Korean, it makes me recall things I've heard about how South Korea is very conservative often when it comes between the relations between male and female people.
Yeah.
And that there's that sort of growing loud group of misogynistic men in Korea. Mm-hmm. And that what Nora is and what she wants doesn't gel with the place she left necessarily. Not that Hae-sung is like that, but Hae-sung is so ordinary.
Yeah, I feel like at the beginning of the film, it feels as if like they have this playful competition with one another, and he loses that.
Well, because he came in first on a test, and she came in second, yes. Right? Yeah.
For me, the film ultimately has to do with Nora being completely able to give herself up to her husband. And
Okay.
so there's like little tits and bits, like
Bits and bits.
tits and bits.
It's not that kind of movie.
Bits and tits, baby.
Okay.
But it's this, like, I do agree with the whole thing, and you can read it about
Well, I think her Korean identity is like a big part of the
Korean
movie.
identity is a big part of the film. I think it also has to do with the fact that, like, when they start having a conversation again, like Haesung, like, jokingly is like to ask her, "Are you still a big crybaby?" And she's like, "No, I don't cry anymore. When I first immigrated to Canada, I cried every day, but then I stopped because nobody cared." And you could see, like, the look on his face as he's like almost setting himself up to be like, "I'm going to be the person that cares." But towards the end,
She does cry.
she does cry,
And she's comforted by Arthur, her husband.
yes,
Yeah.
and she apologizes while she's crying as he holds her.
Okay.
And so I think it's like John, how do you say his last? Magaro as the husband he is one of those rare characters that I feel like I don't know anybody that would do what he was willing to do. Like,
because I saw somebody refer to it as, they're like, all three of the people are just so aware of each other, and everybody's just kind of walking as carefully as they possibly can.
Yeah,
like nobody wants to upset anyone.
You can feel like the tension simmering, but it never boils over, right? You can feel as if like something is supposed to occur, but it never happens because everybody's so emotionally mature to accept what it is.
It's anti-melodrama.
Yes.
It's not playing. It's not gonna. There's not gonna be a big passionate kiss or anything. It's trying to be a stylized film, yet still recreate aspects of human interaction in a realistic way.
Yeah, and like Haesung, when he goes to Nora, it's one of those instances where they're having a conversation, they're walking down New York, and she tells him, "Oh, me and Arthur went to Seoul. I emailed you. You never responded back. That made me very sad." And it is supposed to be like she's already had a conversation with Arthur about why he, like, Haesung is there.
Yeah, because everybody's aware of everyone. There's no secrets here.
And when she comes home with the full realization that Haesung has come to New York to see her. And it is like Arthur then talking to her about like, "I know it annoys you that I'm trying to learn Korean, but when you sleep and you dream, you talk out loud in Korean.
Yeah.
And I just want to understand you." And it is this thing of, I think for me, the love story is them two, because the way Haesung always sees her is always in the past. You are the girl that left. You're the girl that leaves.
When at the bar, she has that whole conversation with him about like, well, that person existed and is here, but there's also like more to that person now.
Well, she's like, "I left that girl with you."
Yeah.
And
I even feel it's more complex than that, because she kind of talks about like, that girl exists, but I also exist, and it's more complex than just going, "Oh, you're still the girl that went up the stairs and I went the other way."
Yeah.
It was but that girl became another person. So the person he's searching for doesn't exist in this moment in time anymore.
Yeah.
The person that he's searching for is his memory.
Yeah. And the thing is, like, Nora constantly is building up to want things, right? She talked about wanting like she wanted certain awards when she was younger, and like he asked her again, like, "What award do you want now?" And then when they meet within the present tense, it's like she has another award that she wants. And when they meet talking during Skype, neither of them are willing to give up something for each other because everything is waited until over a year, right?
Yeah, that was the moment where like, if this was going to become something, that was their chance.
Yes. And so she is going to her residency, and she's like, "If I do my residency, that means I cannot see you."
It was like a year and a half.
Like, her residency's for a year. And then he's like, "Well, I'm going to go to China to learn Mandarin because it'll do a benefit for my engineering." But when we see them in the present, he talks about not being satisfied with his job, about the fact that he doesn't make enough money to live on his own or get married. So it's all these things that he's building towards, he never got to them. And then
she's embraced her passions and is making them happen. She's creating art.
Even though, like, say she talks about the fact that her and Arthur got married a little bit like younger than they anticipated because she needed a green card. And there's this very touching moment that, like, it hit me because it felt like conversations that we've had when she's talking to Arthur and she's like, and he's like, this is a great story. Like, he's reflecting it because he's a writer himself, being like,
he's telling her, this, you should write this as a story.
Like, he was like, this is a great story. He's like, it's like, I'm the evil white like American who's stealing you away. And she's like, you forget that I love you. And he tells her, I don't forget it. I just find it hard to believe. And I feel like that's conversations we've had with each other about being like, look up all these things that I do with you because I love you. And like, we've always been like, yeah, but it's so hard for me to believe that you love me that much.
When that comes from like their respective childhoods. We never get a peek into like Arthur's childhood, but as like a Jew in America, there's a lot of rejection that happens at multiple levels.
Yeah, so he learns to play certain games that her parents love to play, like he learns Korean.
Which I like that he's learning Korean and she clearly is getting much more and more rusty with Korean.
Yes.
And so I thought that was very interesting when she's trying to type something in Korean to send to Hae-sung. She's not quite sure if it translates correctly or not.
Especially when they start talking in Skype. It's like, and I felt that hesitation when you're not speaking your native tongue anymore, where I have to be like, okay, my main language now is English because I barely speak Spanish. And it's like, the way that they write her with that hesitation is so great, but her facial expressions are amazing. And
well, I think of all the three main actors, I think Greta Lee is Nora, the strongest in the cast. The others aren't bad, like, but she stands out.
Charming, and also the chemistry that she has with both actors is amazing because they're having a conversation in the bar. And Hae-sung, with all his fucking might, like, she's told him, my husband is learning Korean.
Yeah.
And he's telling her about, like, I just keep thinking about the what ifs. And
it's like, a big, like, confessional moment. And her husband's sitting on her other side in the bar. Yeah.
And, like, he's like, you know, what if were we together? Would we be breaking up? Would we got married? Like, would we have been sweethearts? He's like, all these things. But he's also, like, Hae-sung is also heartbroken because he tells her, I didn't think it would hurt so much to like your husband.
Mm-hmm.
Because it's like Arthur is not forcing himself in the conversation. Mm-hmm. He's sitting there and you could think that it's brooding, but then she's like, when he's like going about being like, no, the people that were meant to be was supposed to be you and Arthur. Mm-hmm. You two were supposed to come together. You two probably have past lives with mm-hmm. each other. And this was the time for you guys to be together. And maybe like when we were together in our past, we were horrible to each other. And this is our, like, this is why we can't.
Because Inyun, I think it's a Korean idea around this sort of fate that crosses through like multiple existences.
Yeah.
And so it was like the universe is trying to keep us apart because it knows that it's bad.
Yeah. And so how she turns around and tells him he's talking about you. And like Nora leaves for a moment and Hae-sung tells Arthur, I know we've been talking a lot alone. We will stop. And Arthur's just like, it's fine. It's okay. It is like Arthur is the one that will squeeze your heart out of your chest because he's kind of like,
he's so accommodating he's trying not to order her about what to do, but he still expresses vulnerability and pain.
Yes. And it is, I think to me, that's why I feel like Nora and Arthur are the love story at the end, because he is willing to allow his wife to have this moment, because afterwards she is vulnerable and open to him. And it's like within that safety that he knows everything about her then.
I really love the opening of the movie. And I think it was so cleverly done because it is that bar scene. So we jump ahead to the present in the opening moment before we go all the way back to their childhood. And it's the slow zoom of the camera in on, we've got Haesung, Nora in the middle, Arthur on the other side. And they're in conversation, but we hear people off screen who are in the bar on the other side of the bar, people watching. And they're going, who do you think these three people are to each other? And it's such like, it's a conversation that not done well, you would have been like, oh, okay. It's like, it would be kind
They're
of,
gonna tell the
it would be
story
kind of like It's a
too.
Wonderful Life, where you have the angels kind of narrating and letting you know.
Yeah.
But instead, what it does is it sets up all the questions that you're going to need to think about for the rest of the movie. Who are these three people to each other?
Yeah.
Uh, and then by the end of the movie, you know who they all are to each other.
Yeah.
I found Hae-sung to be, I think, the saddest character in the movie because he just
Oh, yeah.
seems so like he doesn't know what he wants in the world. He's just sort of, like I said, he just feels like somebody who's just drifting along and doesn't
Yeah.
really,
And
and she's so different than that.
and like he looks at Nora like, and then I remember like he does tell her like Korea was going to be too small for you. Of course you couldn't have stayed, because she talks about having immigrated twice. And like he looks at her like with this awe, but she's kind of like, you could have done something too. Like
He just seems frozen in
he's
place.
so like, he does this thing where he's like, I'm just ordinary, and she's like, what, you're handsome, you're smart, like I don't
Well,
get it.
and think about the very beginning of the movie. He outscores her on that test, which drives her nuts.
Yeah.
So it's like he's an intelligent guy. He couldn't have become an engineer without doing that. He had a girlfriend.
But
So
it was
that
also
lasted
like,
for years. So it's just,
yeah, it's like this,
he's such an enigma to me because you're like, what? Like, I don't get it. Why won't you?
yeah,
Why
and
won't you
but
do
it's also
anything?
this interesting thing that like before he goes to New York and he's like, I'm going on vacation, his friends are like, you're not going to go see that girl, right? You don't think we're stupid, right?
Yeah, they even think he's like, it's a bad idea.
And
Like, what are you doing?
and like they talk, oh, she got married young. And it's just supposed to be like, she doesn't think that she got married young, but she did get married because of the green card. But she's also sort of like, I do love my husband though.
But I also think like she is passionate, and I don't see a passion in Haesung other than like for his memory of her. But
Yeah.
she's passionate about not a person. Like she loves her husband passionately, but like she's driven by a desire to create something, to do something.
Yeah, like they have that again, that interesting conversation that Arthur and her have, that he's like, well, what if you had met someone else that like the same movie, same books, like
and was a writer,
was a writer and gave you notes for all your playwrights, what, and that would listen to you bitch about it. And she's just sort of like, I'm with you. Like Nora does not live in the what if. She's not like
she's not Haesung, who is
Hae-sung.
constantly going, what if Nora had stayed?
What if I had gone
Yeah.
to see her? Da, da, da.
Thinks about those things, but they don't dominate her thinking. She
Yeah.
understands that, like, but that didn't happen.
Yeah.
So I
and
can't,
so
it doesn't matter.
More grounded between the two men in her life, even though like Arthur is sort of like, it's almost like indicating to her like, but you met me and it was like a rebound kind of thing, and we ended up married and you have to stay, so we got married. But she's just sort of like, but I love you, I have no questions about like that. It is against,
well, it's kind of about saying that we grow to love people, that we just aren't destined to love people.
I think it's also just, we forget so much that like, as we've talked about in the podcast before, like love is work.
Yeah.
And she joked about like, yes, I'm going to leave my husband and go to Korea to Seoul with this
yeah
man.
Like, and when you lay it out, you're like, yeah, it's absurd, no one's gonna do that. Like, especially when she's in the middle of like producing a play and like they're doing wardrobe. Is no, she's not going to uproot her entire life because she's making the thing that she's wanted to happen.
Well, it's also sort of like she's not in that moment like that her parents were, that they needed a change. She knows who she is, she's accomplishing these goals, and she's met with someone who has goals himself, that is a writer himself, that like gives her notes, that sort of like, this is a person who is expanding her own universe of knowledge and influence.
It's like a feedback loop. They're both
Yes.
informing each other of new things and generating ideas.
Exactly. And it's just
And that's
sort
why
of like
I say Hae Sung is such a dullard compared to this.
yeah, and it just but I think it's such an interesting and touching perspective, because it's like, I think one of my favorite moments was like, they're like, oh, we went on a boat and we saw like the Statue of Liberty, and her husband goes, I've never seen that. And you
And he's
can
lived
see,
in
like,
New York his whole life.
the guilt on her face, because like even like Hae Sung is like, you need to take your husband there.
But like I think I relate to that because I'm like, I lived in Tennessee and there were plenty of places in Tennessee. Like I never went to Knoxville. I'd never been to Knoxville, and that's one of the big cities.
Like,
I'm
it's
like,
like
oh.
the funny thing of her feeling this guilt that you could see just radiating off of her, and Arthur's kind of like, yeah, I've just never been, not a big deal.
But I think it's that like the thing of, well, when you grow up in a place, those places don't hold significance
But
to you.
I think it's also because it, like, Nora felt as if she was like,
She had an experience with Hae Sung that she should have had with Arthur.
yes,
Yeah.
and it's just like,
But to Arthur, it's not a big deal because he's seen the Statue of Liberty from a distance. He doesn't need to get on a ferry and get that close
yeah, and
to
I
it.
think it's just like he's just making conversation,
Yeah.
and
for him, it's part of the landscape.
yeah, and it's just I still think it's a wonderfully touching film. I think like it does pull on my heartstrings. Like I was on the edge of crying, and even on the edge of crying when talking about it, but no tears were seeped out. That's only for Elephant Man.
Because you're a cold-hearted person. What I loved the most about it was the director's refusal to turn this into a melodrama, to go over the top, to have some passionate kiss between the young lovers or whatever. Like
No.
she did everything she could to ground the story.
That's why I say I said at the beginning, like, it's, if we're going to talk about simple movies that can be international movies, I feel like this one fits the bill. I feel like it's telling you, if you want to watch a movie about immigration, you can watch another film. This is not that film.
I would say it would pair well with Return to Seoul.
Yeah.
Because they're both movies about Korean women who have been removed from Korean culture.
Yeah.
Trying to grapple with what about that culture is still a part of who I am now.
Yeah, and it's that interesting thing of like her parents. Like
who still stay in Canada, which is
stay in Canada, but I really love this idea of her mom being like, I'm going to make sure that before she leaves, she has the best memories of Korea before she leaves. Like that was her mother's whole deal. And like,
but in turn, those memories like haunt her daughter for like 24 years.
But it's like, it's not a daunting haunting. It's
just is having to come to terms with something.
Yeah, it's also like the fact that this person who knew you so well and wishes to know you, but can never fully know you the way, like, for example, her husband knows her now. Because Hae Sung hasn't been there as she's like done playwrights, released stuff. Like he hasn't been through like the trenches that her husband has. Like, well, who he saw was this child who had to grow up by herself, essentially. And how that made her who she is now.
Who had to change her name when they moved.
And it was like the name that her father ended up giving her. Like their parents, another thing, like the parents just being like, you guys are going to choose your names and you're going to choose what your American names are. And like the father suggesting a name to his daughter. It turns out like her father is a film director, and her mother is an artist. So they are non-traditionals, which allows Nora to we don't have to have this whole thing where Nora's like, I really make my parents disappointed.
Well, that thing, but the fact that her family upbringing is so non-traditional, that's why whenever we see who Hae Sung has become, he's so traditional.
Yeah, and it's like, no matter if she had stayed or not, she would have not been.
Yeah, I don't think they would have stayed together because she would have had ambitions. He just doesn't. Or he doesn't seem to know what it is he wants from his life.
I think it's just like he doesn't want to rock the boat. And so like he didn't go visit her in New York because that would change everything in his own life. He would have to like decide what to do with himself. Versus Nora has already put herself on this path, and she's kind of like why would I, if you're not going to try to make an attempt to see me, then I'm not going to change my path for you.
I want to point out the cinematography was done by Shabir Kirchner, who we had previously seen as he was the cinematographer of all of Steve McQueen's Small Axe movies. So every single one of those films he put out in 2020,
Yeah.
Kirchner did the cinematography for.
Yeah, it was like beautifully shot. Like it's
Once again, it has, I think the cinematography that David Fincher has pushed has been some of the most influential.
Yes.
Because once again, I see that come up here with those oranges, yellows, where browns, the very earthy kind of colors, but lit, like illuminated in a way that's very interesting.
Yeah.
And then I liked how different periods of time, because the movie takes place over the course of 24 years, the color palettes change and the tone of the film's look changes slightly.
Yeah.
There's continuity between them, which I think is supposed to kind of represent Nora. She's the continuous string throughout all these, but that they're reflecting different moods and changes that she's going through as a person. Because I feel like that scene in the bar, it felt very like urban New York to me. It had that feel. And that's something that, like, that's who she is now. The scenes in South Korea have a more almost like pastoral, pastel, kind of soft look to them.
Yeah.
And that's who she was as a child. And so visually, the film changes with her, which I really liked. The score for the film was done by Christopher Bear and Daniel Rawson, who are a half of Grizzly Bear.
Yeah.
And I thought they did a good job in that once I saw that it was them, I could hear the Grizzly Bear influence, especially I think in some of the guitars that were used.
Mm-hmm.
But it also felt very distinct. It was sort of like 1001 that had that very kind of Quincy Jones influence score.
Yeah.
And where it felt like, oh, I don't hear this music matched with images like these often.
Yeah. And it wasn't overwhelming.
No.
They weren't just being like, let's put the music in and it's gonna like really fuck with your idea of the scenery.
But it wasn't ambient either, which I think sometimes a lot of modern film scores are so low key. It's just a drone. Like there were melodies, there were refrains that would come up. Characters had little like themes, but it was the perfect kind of music to match this story. I felt like if we make comparisons to movies, we mentioned Return to Seoul, but I also thought it shared a lot of similarities with Wong Kar-wai's In the Mood for Love.
Yeah.
And this sort of two people who want to be together, but circumstances are so complicated, and ultimately it's probably not a good idea that you're together.
I mean, I thought it reminded me of Normal People, which you've not seen, but I've read the book and saw the series, where it's supposed to be like two people who like deeply do love each other. But I like the fact that they did the same thing as in Normal People did in the book and the series, where we don't get to see like pieces of Nora's work, or we don't see pieces of Arthur's work. Like we don't have him doing.
We do have the one scene where they're doing like a rehearsal, and we hear a few bits of dialogue.
Yeah,
but it's not enough to really get a full picture.
Yeah, and then like with the rehearsals, we're not really sure if like it's supposed to be that they're auditioning people, so they're like
I think it was. Yeah,
and which I kind of like that, because then it doesn't add this extra pressure on the writer to write something really great within.
Well, what it is the film is the work, because it's based on real experiences that the director had. So it's like the film you're watching is a representation of the character's work. Yeah.
And like with Normal People, it's at the end of just being like they have to be pulled apart because they have different ambitions that they have at the end of the day, and that like their lives were better because they had met.
Well, I also think it's very similar to Richard Linklater's Before Sunrise, where it's a lot of talking, but it's interesting to listen to.
Yeah.
And there are a lot of talky films that are not, but like Before Sunrise and this, they're movies where you want to hear these people talk to each other because you're learning things about them and each other and their interconnections.
Yeah, the chemistry that they hold with each other, the way that, like, for example, Hae-sung is like telling Nora, well, your Korean is rusty, and she builds up confidence, but it's also like the fact that there's so much of like her facial expression that gives out to what she's saying. And it's also like the change of her face when she goes from Korean to English. Like her voice is more high pitched versus in Korean. It is like almost like husky and low. And it is such an interesting thing to do because I feel like American films really don't take advantage of the fact that they have bilingual actors out there that can really show range by speaking in like different languages. Like I think about like Greta Lee, who plays Nora in this film, and then I think about Stephen Young in Burning. Was that the name?
Yeah,
like he's fully Korean in the whole like the whole film, and it's something that
you get a different performance in that language than you do when he performs in English.
Yes, and that is so interesting and can tell you how good that actor is.
Well, I think of it,
flip.
it's something that I think I can tell from like Spanish actors, because I'll see, you know, an actor, an Antonio Banderas in like an Almodovar movie, and then I'll see him in an American movie. And to me, I'm like, oh, his Almodovar movies are far more interesting because I think they're better written. But then also as a performer, there's something different about the Spanish language than there is the English language. And for him as an actor, it brings something out of him that the other doesn't.
Like when he does the English language ones, they always emphasize on his accent, like somebody has her
almost like a caricature.
Yeah, and then like how it'll dull or change during time, which is not to say he's not a great actor. They just don't.
That's what's being asked from him.
But they don't push him in the way an Almodovar movie, which is done. And all like I've seen other actors that speak Spanish that will pick up accents in Spanish. And you just want to applaud them, but you know very well that the American audience would not give a shit. And it was like, I hope more films like this are made where we see the duality of these people being able to do something so remarkable.
Oh, and I think it's, as much as A24 got a lot of praise for Everything Everywhere All at Once, it was a movie I liked. I didn't love it. I was glad that it won a ton of Oscars, because if a movie had to win a ton of Oscars, I'd rather it be that than some of the others. But I also was worried that A24 would become kind of the zany studio.
Yeah.
And I'm glad to see that maybe they learned the right lessons, in that we should let the reason why Everything Everywhere All at Once worked so well, and the reason why Past Lives worked so well, is the people who made the movie were allowed to make the movie they wanted to make.
Yes.
And it matched their sensibilities. And so they were as comfortable as possible in the making of the film, meaning that they made something that was deep and worth exploring and had lots of ideas in it and was multifaceted. But yeah, I'm not someone who gives a shit about awards season, so I don't know if this movie's going to win awards. It doesn't really matter to me anyway. I think it's probably going to be A24's best film of the year.
Yeah.
From the other things I've seen that have come out and what might be coming out, I don't think anything else is going to get to this height. But yeah, very good movie, well worth watching. Well, that was the Pop Cult Podcast. We hope you enjoyed this episode. Make sure to check out our show notes for relevant links to things that we might have mentioned, or other ways that you can get in contact with us. That includes the link to our website, popcult.blog. And if you check out our blog at the moment, you're going to find that we're wrapping up our Flashback to 1983 series. We've been looking at movies that turned 40 years old this year. A lot of movies that I missed because I was only 2 years old at the time and just had never seen in the time since, and have discovered some really good ones. We also have a review of the first season of The Bear coming up this week. And then in September, we're going to be kicking off a month-long Noir Masterworks series. We'll be looking at a whole host of classic film noir, including Laura, The Postman Always Rings Twice, Out of the Past, The Big Heat, Touch of Evil, and more. If you enjoy what we do here, the first thing we're going to ask is that you subscribe wherever it is that you listen to podcasts, so you'll be notified when our new episodes pop up. And secondly, we'd ask you to check out our Patreon. We've got some different reward levels to pick from. Speaking of, I want to thank our patrons, Morphine, who donates at the sneak preview level, Becca and Matt, who donate at the writer's room level. At that level, they get to pick a movie every month for me to watch and review. And if you do that, you can include your thoughts in that review as well, if you wish. If you subscribe to our Patreon, you also get immediate access to our patron-exclusive podcast episodes that we do over there. So far, we've got, I think, 2 series up, 6 episodes each. And coming at the end of September, we'll be doing a new series where I think we're going to experiment with some GM-less 2-player tabletop games and try to kind of generate story ideas to write for something. We'll find out. Well, until next time, keep listening.